Welcome to this calf rearing full performance webinar brought to you by NZAgbiz, presented by Dr Sue McCord from AgResearch and Michael Shallcrass from Fonterra. Mike is a veterinary program manager with an extensive background in veterinary science. Mike is passionate about identifying and promoting the best farming practices across New Zealand, working closely with Kiwi farmers to ensure sustainable and successful outcomes for their herds. Sue is a senior scientist at AgResearch, who has spent much of her career researching livestock rearing, survival and nutrition for animals raised for the meat and dairy industries. Sue is passionate about sharing this expertise to empower farmers and drive innovation in animal care and nutrition.
In this section, we want to talk about how solid feed drives rumen development and is really important, even from a young age, to getting a smooth weaning experience with your calves. So, as we talked about before, a calf is born with a very underdeveloped rumen. You know, the four stomachs of the cow, the rumen, the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum. In the very young calf, the abomasum makes up about 60% of the size of the stomachs, and in the adult cow, it's about 80%. And we want to try and get from that pre-ruminant stage through to that ruminant phase as smoothly as possible, with the minimum disruption to the calf's growth and kind of performance through that period. So that's what we're always trying to trade off, is that you've got some things that will drive rumen development, but they slow down growth rates. And you've got things that will lead to high growth rates, but they might slow down rumen development. So like everything else in calf rearing, it's a balance between kind of what you can achieve in your system and what you're trying to aim for. So lots of different things will impact how quickly that rumen develops, how big that rumen is, how capable it is of digesting the kind of the fibrous cellulose and plant fibers that the abomasum isn't capable of digesting. So what we're going to look at now are the different things that you can do on your farm that are going to help support a good rumen development to make those calves ready for weaning.
That's right, Mike. And this slide here is really just to show what the rumen looks like on the inside. So there's in the top right-hand corner is a nice little picture of rumen papillae. And that's what we're wanting to see inside the rumen of the calf, so that they can actually digest and utilize that solid feed that they're consuming. To get to that point though, they start out as a newborn calf. On the left-hand side, you see those little white, tiny carpet, very short pile carpet looking things. That's the immature rumen. And so our goal during that rearing process is to try and promote not just the physical development, so that's the size of the rumen, the musculature around the rumen so it can actually function properly, and to grow that pile on the carpet so that it starts to grow and look like the picture on the right, but also to develop that rumen physiologically. So in other words, how the wall of the rumen can absorb those nutrients, how the calf's metabolic system can change from using nutrients from milk to nutrients that are generated from the rumen. They are different nutrients and the metabolic system has to change, but also the microbial system within the rumen has to change as well, because there's different microbes that digest and utilize different feeds as well. So we've really got a lot of work for the calf to be doing in that very early time in development, those first few weeks, to get that rumen up to speed to be able to cope with not having milk in the system. And that's where our solid feeds come in. And it's not just solid feeds in the form of a starter diet or a meal or a concentrate. They are really important supplements to help support that rumen development, but forage is also critically important to make sure that we get the right microbial environment to utilize forage. And ultimately, we want to get those calves out of the shed, out onto pasture and off supplementary feeds as quickly as possible. And as the cows or calves get older, obviously we want them to be relying on consuming forage only. So giving them access to forage very early on is really important, and there's many studies that have shown the importance of that. So just coming back to when do we actually start to see solid feed intake in a calf? And you guys all know in your systems, when you're looking at your calves in the shed, if you've got them in there for a few weeks, if you haven't got solid feed available in terms of starter diets or hay, for example, in the pens, you'll often see them starting to eat their bedding, if it's straw or even bits of bark and things. So, and that can happen from a week or two of age. So it's really important that we have that solid feed available right from the beginning. So that as they're ready, and each calf is different in terms of when they are actually ready to start and eat solid feed, but once they're ready to start and eat, they've got that feed available to start and nibble on. It's important to understand that although high starch starters can promote rumen growth, and there's a number of studies that are suggesting that is the case, but they can also increase acidosis risk. So just something to be, again, monitoring in the calves if they're starting to eat quite a lot of starter diet, to be aware of the signs of acidosis. But as I say, forages are also really important. They play not just a role in the physical development of the rumen, but they also help to stabilize rumen pH. But they can be quite bulky, and particularly in low milk systems, when the calf is a little bit hungrier and is eating more solid feed, you'll get a lot more gut fill out of forages. And so because of that, they don't have as much space in their gut for consuming other feeds, and that may also limit growth. So it's, again, as Mike was saying earlier, about balance. Give the calves options, get them, enable them to choose what they want to eat, and make sure those different types of feeds are available very early on.
Yeah, what kind of solid feed should you be using? And you want it to be high quality, and you want it to be of a good variety. So it's not just one or the other. You see people talking about, oh, you need to feed lots of meal to drive the rumen, surface development, or we need to feed hay because it's got that scratch factor, or it's got more bulk to kind of drive rumen musculature. All of that is true. And so it's trying to make sure that you've got options for those calves, because they will pick and choose the thing that they need. And so just making sure that whatever you've got is going to be attractive for them to eat. If you've got a bucket of old meal there, it's been sitting there for days, it's got a bit wet, they're less likely to eat it. If you're relying on them to eat their own bedding to get their fiber access, then they're not going to eat as much of it as if you've set up a proper feeder for them. So giving them free access to a variety of high quality hard feeds from birth is going to result in a more rapid rumen development than if you hold off until several weeks later, or you only give them part of that kind of total balanced diet. It's worth remembering the value of pasture here, that like quite often people are putting calves or providing calves with access to the outdoors from a reasonably early age, and those calves will be eating some pasture. So it's not, when we're talking about monitoring hard feed intake, it's not just those supplementary feeds that you're offering them, it's also what are they starting to nibble on outside, because that's, as Sue said, that's what we want them. The rumen and the gut will adapt to maximize digestion of the thing that you feed them. And if the thing that we ultimately want them to be eating is grass, then we need to be making sure that they're getting access to some of that from really early on.
That's right, Mike. And just to give an example of how it's important to monitor what the calves are actually doing and what they're eating. We often think we get told when we're feeding calves that we want to get that starter intake up to at least 1 to 2 kilos a day before we wean the calf. I just wanted to share with you some results from a recent trial that we did in some crossbred calves or Frisian Jersey crossbred calves. But you'll notice in the background there was a little Charolais calf that popped up as a wee surprise in the study, but he stayed in the group. These calves were being fed about 1,050 grams of CMR a day, once daily from the time that we took them outside at 4 weeks of age. And what I wanted to show you here is that on that feeding system, we had good growth rates of those calves. They got to approximately 100 kilos within 80 days. And I've put up the average daily gains up there in that little table for you to see the growth rates. They were pretty reasonable. But the thing that was interesting in this study is that the starter intake, the meal, it was a 22% commercially available meal, highly palatable, should have been something that the calves wanted to eat heaps of. In that first 6 weeks or so, they were eating less than 100 grams a day. And after that, they slowly started to eat a little bit more, but even at 10 to 11 weeks of age, they were eating on average less than 400 grams per head per day. So they wouldn't have actually reached that feed them 1 to 2 kilos of starter. And the reason why they didn't reach that is that they had plenty of good quality fresh forage available. And when we were out observing those calves in the paddock, and that's a photo of those calves, the vast majority of the time they had their head down eating grass, and they really didn't go over to the feeder very often to be able to consume the starter that we offered them. This was another study that we did a few years ago, asking the question of, can we rear calves with a forage only system? So this was actually looking at a starter that was grain free. And in this study, we used an ensiled alfalfa and we compared it to a grain based meal. And the calves were fed the same amount of milk, and they were either weaned at 49 days, so an early weaning system, or at 84 days, so a later weaning system. And there was both heifers and bulls in this study. What we saw in that study for those earlier weaned calves, not surprisingly, their solid feed intake was higher because they had to replace the milk with something. And because their solid feed intake was higher, they had greater metabolic development of the rumen. But those calves that were weaned later, because they were consuming more milk and that nutrient-dense feed, they had higher growth rates, but they also had higher mammary gland mass, so bigger udders at the time that they were weaned. And so this may give some insights as to why in those previous slides I mentioned earlier around the importance of that pre-weaning average daily gain and the impact that it has on future milk production. These studies, not just this one, but quite a few others, are starting to show that early development and driving up of growth rate pre-weaning, particularly through feeding more milk, is actually having some benefits for the development of that mammary gland, which is likely contributing to that better lactation performance when those calves are entering the herd. And this was another study where we fed just forage only. And in this study, we had two different systems that we were comparing. There was the low input 4 litres of milk a day with free access to a grain-based starter versus an 8 litres of milk with free access to grass, but with no starter. This was a lifetime study, so we kept these cattle for quite a long time. They were Hereford Friesian cross heifers. And in addition to that pre-weaning feeding system, we also changed the quality of the forage that they had post-weaning in that period up to about 7 months. So it's that sort of first summer, if you like. And I just wanted to share with you the observations from this study. So on the left-hand side of this graph, this is showing the live weight gain of the calves throughout the time frame that we had them in the study. The calves that were fed high levels of milk and pasture only and were weaned a little bit later, it's important to recognise they were fed milk a little bit longer as well. They were 10 kilos heavier at weaning. And that 10 kilos benefit stayed with the life of the animal. So they didn't lose that benefit the older they got. The ones that were on the lower milk system didn't catch up. And that benefit was maintained whether those calves were fed on a high quality forage or a lower quality forage over the next few months over that summer period. So at the end of summer grazing, the ones that were fed on a good quality forage plus the high milk or the low milk system were about 40 kilos heavier than ones fed on poor quality forage. So the take-home message there is that it's not just important to feed good quality feeds up to the point of weaning, but to continue to feed them high quality feed after weaning. And so these calves had the ones that were fed the high milk system, they were given access to forage very early on. So from a week of age, they were outside and eating pasture, whereas the ones on the low milk system, they were kept housed for the first 7 or so weeks. And so that benefit that we gave those calves of that early access to forage and feeding them high levels of milk, I've talked about that 10 kilo advantage, that was maintained thereafter. And so what we were seeing there is that those calves could transition and utilize forage much earlier and have a much better weaning transition, but it also supported their further development. And the bit on the right-hand side, I just thought it may be of interest for those of you that might be rearing calves for dairy beef as opposed to replacements. The other advantage that we saw by feeding them the high levels of milk and good quality pasture post-weaning is that 70% of those calves were sold before their second winter. And that's really important from an efficiency perspective to be able to get those calves off farm early and to be able to, and that was really driven by those high growth rates. But if you try and draw a parallel between the dairy beef and a dairy system, as you can see, better growth rates throughout the life of that animal will also have implications for calves that are entering your herd in terms of their weight at puberty and weight in first lactation. So I think there's some good parallels that can be drawn there. So concentrate versus forage starter. I've talked about a couple of different examples of trials where we've used a non-grain forage just to illustrate that you can rear calves on a non-grain system. And this was just another study where we had Holstein Friesian bulls where we were looking at the development of those calves. When they're fed a forage-only diet, we do get that higher gut fill that we talked about earlier. And although this diet was able to support good rumen development and good growth rates, the growth rates weren't quite as high as those calves that were getting concentrates pre-weaning. So they were a little bit lighter at weaning, but it was interesting in that they quickly caught up post-weaning, and that's simply because they were better set up to utilize the forage that they were given, so to be able to utilize the pasture that they were eating. So there was no lifetime negative impact of feeding them a non-grain diet. And so if you're thinking about what types of feeds do I want to be offering my calf, a lot of it will depend on the type of rearing system you're running, whether you're going to have them indoors or whether they can go outdoors early, how much space you've got and how much forage you can be offering them. But I think the key take home from these studies is that you can offer them a variety in all of the different types of solid feeds, provided they're good quality and you're feeding them enough, will support good development of the calf. And this is just an example of when we don't get that weaning transition right. So this is a graph showing growth rates of calves pre-weaning up, and in this study, weaning was done at 49 days, so about 7 weeks. And what you'll be able to see here on the blue line, so that blue line was calves that were fed a high volume of milk. They were fed around about 8 litres a day. And at that point of 49 days, you'll see that that blue line drops right down and then slowly starts to pop its way back up between that 56 and 70 days of age. Now, what that's showing is that those calves in this particular study that were fed high levels of milk weren't able to cope well with weaning, and that was because they had poorer rumen development driven by low solid feed intake. In this particular study, they were only consuming about 1/2 kilo of starter a day, and the only solid feed they had available was the starter diet. This was a study done in the Netherlands where the calves were held in hutches, so individual little pens. So they're very different to a New Zealand system, but it's a good way to illustrate how if a calf is not consuming enough solid feed, it can have a negative effect on the growth rate of the calves, and it takes them a while to recover. And you'll see that red line, those calves didn't have that drop off in growth rate, and that's because they had high solid feed intake prior to weaning.
But then there's that question, how much meal should my cows be eating? When am I able to kind of wean them off supplementary feed and onto just pasture? And this is one of those how long is a piece of string sorts of questions that there's lots of different ways that people will commonly use to decide when it's time to wean calves off meal, and they'll talk about, I wean them at such and such age, or I wean them when their milk intake, is this, or I look for their forage intake, or I look for how much, like an absolute body weight. There's lots of different factors that kind of come into play here, and so it's really hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer, or it's not possible to give a one-size-fits-all answer. So as Sue talked about before, it is quite common to hear people talking about, they're aiming for the calves to be eating 1.5 kilos of meal or 2 kilos of meal each. But then if you've got a system where there's lots of good grass around, they may never reach that, but they're really well set up to transition onto pasture and off milk. And so I think the thing that's important here is coming up with a system within your system to identify when those calves look like or when they are ready to transition off milk and onto solid feed only. And that's hard to do when all you're doing is kind of looking at them. So what other things can we think about measuring that could help us work out when we should be weaning? And you can't improve what you don't measure. That's that kind of truism there, that ideally what you want to do is go, okay, how much are these animals eating? Not just how much meal, but what other things are they consuming? How much are they drinking if they're still on milk? How much are they growing? You can't measure growth unless you're measuring, using scales or a weigh tape, or even just height, just some kind of a objective measure that you can go, this is what they were before, this is what they are now. What's their body condition? Are they looking nice and plump, or are they have they been underfed? Now, do they need some more fattening up? Do they need some extra support? That's Sue touched on it briefly before. It's actually quite common for us to see heifers or R1s get a growth check when they come off meal and they come into their first summer and the quality of the pasture declines. Maybe that's actually a time, if you've been monitoring growth rates, that you go, actually we need to add something back into the system. We could get some supplementary feed of some sort in there to support that growth rates and keep them going on a rising body weight through to their first mating. What's the calves' health? If they've had a disease check of some sort, then they're probably going to be ready for weaning later than if they've been healthy right the way through. So if you've had an issue come through the shed, maybe delay that final weaning off meal, another couple of weeks or something like that. Are they ruminating? That's actually something that's pretty easy to check. You just go in and look at them. Are they sitting down, chewing the cud in the sunshine? Is the ideal there. If you're not seeing much rumination behavior, then their rumen's probably not ready to provide their sole nutrition. And then that thing about behavior, are they still hungry for milk? Are they still hungry for the meal? Are they grazing quite contentedly? So key messages here: you want your initial solid feed to be high quality and freely available and a good variety, and it is possible to do that without meal, you can do it with forage-based stuff, but because forage is going to be ultimately what these calves are eating, whether you're going with a meal-based or a forage-based supplementary feed for the calves, there should be some forage in there at some point, because that's what you're priming them to be subsisting on, post weaning off everything else. If you're feeding really high milk levels, then that can reduce their starter intake, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a trade-off that you've got to be conscious of when you're planning your weaning system. If you've been feeding really high levels of milk, you might need to wean them more slowly to give them time to replace that energy they were getting from the milk with energy they're getting from feed. And the sooner you can get that hard feed available to them, even at a young age where they're just nibbling at it, that still helps drive rumen development from early on. I think the thing that we haven't touched on here is water. The other thing that drives rumen development is water, because it gives you some of that stretch to get the rumen growing. And so having hard feed and water available from a young age will make your rumens, the calves' rumens, develop much faster. And then particularly when you've got if you're running a lower milk feeding system, you've got to replace those calories from somewhere, and so that's where the hard feed becomes increasingly important if you're running a lower milk system.
So what are some of the practical tips and tricks? And you guys will have lots of them, and I'm sure that you share them with one another, and that's awesome, and keep doing that. Just, I guess, some things top of mind. We've talked about the quality of forages and starter diets, so any supplementary feeds that we're giving to our calves in the same way that we do with milk. Make sure that they're really good quality. Make sure they've got space to be able to get enough of that supplementary feed. So whether you're feeding in a trough type system or covered feeders, or they're getting other forms of supplementary feed, make sure that they've got space so that they're not competing with one another too much to be able to get access. Consider just the same with milk feeding group, those calves by age and size, sometimes by health, as Mike was saying, if they've had a bit of a disease challenge early on, sometimes it's good to run those calves that might have had a little bit of a check separately from the others, so that you can wean them at a different age. We've talked about starting to feed them a little bit at a time, and that's really just to keep the feeds nice and fresh and palatable and encourage them to eat, and then start and increase the amount that they're offered as they get older, and obviously getting rid of anything that's old and wet and been soiled by birds and rain and what have you, because a calf's just not going to eat that. It's really important that we don't limit that amount of solid feed pre-weaning and during that milk weaning phase. So when we start to take milk out, as we've said, the calf's got to replace it with something. So they've got to have those options available to be able to eat something that's not milk, to be able to support that weaning transition and to keep them growing and being healthy. Consider using covered feeders outdoors, just so that you can stop the weather from getting in there, and sometimes stopping birds from getting in there. That helps to keep the quality high, but also stops or to reduce the wastage of that feed, because any supplementary feed costs money, right? And we need to make sure that our systems are profitable. So anything we can do to try and utilize all the feed we've got available, we should do that. And as we've been saying all the way through, measure and monitor what's going on with your calves, whether that be an estimate of how much they're eating, how well they're growing, how healthy they are, whether they seem to be happy and playing and showing some of those positive behaviours. That's all good indicators of whether the calf is doing well. And just to come back and emphasise the importance of that step-down weaning. It's not just important for doing a step-down weaning when you take a calf off milk, especially if they've been on a high milk diet, but step-down weaning off those starter diets, particularly if they're a grain-based starter. Quite often calves will have quite a significant weaning check at the time you take them off the starter, in the same way that they can have a weaning check when you take them off the milk, and sometimes it can be worse. So you need to do those weanings slowly to be able to avoid those negative impacts on the calf. And usually those negative impacts are observed through the calves just don't grow as well, or sometimes they're just not as healthy, and so they take that little bit of a check. And so we can avoid that from happening by just making sure that we do each of those weanings nice and slowly over the period of a couple of weeks, just slowly reducing down the amount of feed that we're giving them.